"You'll never land that bird in this wind, ma'am. Not out here. Not today," the crowd laughed. The laugh was sharp, a serrated thing that cut the air around the ramp and clung to the metal skin of the A-10. He said it like he expected applause, like doubt was entertainment. She did not look up. She tightened her gloves, checked the checklist with fingers that had felt colder deserts and hotter cockpits, and kept her face like slate. Silence is a thing you can train into muscles. Calm is a thing you can ration like fuel. She acknowledged only once, an even, low phrase. Understood, but when the admiral saw the way her hands rested on the yoke, the way her shoulders carried the weight of others' lives without flinching, he slid his cap from his head and did something older and quieter than either insult or laughter. He watched. If you believe steady competence beats loud arrogance, type silence below. They called her Morgan in the squadron, not because of showbiz or heroics, because she signed her forms with that name, and because it fit the old map shoulders of someone who'd been on stations for years. She arrived at the forward operating base with a duffel that had seen salt water and sand, boots that still remembered carrier ladders, and a face the sun had etched into bronze. Her uniform was clean enough, serviceable. There was no theater in her walk. No medals flashed louder than the quiet of her eyes. The antagonist, a man 3 ranks below polite, 3 inches above humility, loved volume. He had a laugh that bowed to no conscience, and a voice that filled rooms the way artillery filled valleys. He loved to own the room with jokes about glass ceilings and delicate nerves. He loved to tell stories about what pilots should and shouldn't try. Today, he would be entertaining his small audience with an impossible claim. The storm today made any A-10 dead stick landing out of the question. The crowd needed certainty. He gave them scorn. The crowd wanted winners. He gave them someone to mock. Morgan made no reply. She set her jaw, closed the canopy, and listened only to the instruments and the wind that roared like a beast testing the fence line. The exercise began as a crisis and became the narrative's hinge. A medevac call had come in from a forward element pinned by a sudden mortar barrage. 1 wounded, urgent. The C-130 had been diverted. The rotary assets were jammed with maintenance, and the only available close-air escort with the capacity to land and evacuate a casualty was the A-10 parked nearest the runway. There are things the A-10 does that no other bird does. It brings precision and presence at slow speeds. It laughs at flak with titanium for breakfast, and some pilots swore it had a heart made from old oak and stubbornness. Morgan salted her headset with a brief, dry line, medevac ready. LZ coordinates set. She shoved the throttles up. The sky had a bruise in it, thunder folding into thunder, crosswinds grappling with the control surfaces like children fighting for a ball. The SEALs who had been besides the ramp, their own mouths closed with the air of a different kind of confidence, washed in a way that held 2 voices, duty and disbelief. They said the wind she couldn't master would toss her like a toy. The SEAL with the loud mouth repeated the joke. "You're landing where? You sure you want to risk that?" Morgan's hands were small against the yoke, but they held a lifetime of landings, carrier traps, dirt strips, treacherous fields, and a rifle-stock memory of lessons taught by men who had lost friends and procedures to keep from losing any more. Foreshadowing lived in the slight burn of her palms, in the way a worn patch on her left glove had been sewn 3 times over. It would mean nothing to the man making jokes. It would mean everything when the engines sang and the runway fought back. She briefed herself in a way people who live with high stakes do. Tight, internal, ritualistic. Fuel, hydraulic pressure, flap settings, on-block clip check, main gear alignment. Her breathing synchronized with the sweep of the windscreen wipers, with the digital pulse of the HUD. The narrator notices, twice, how the word silence gathers in the cockpit like static before a storm. The barometric needle bounced. The crosswind component read higher than the manual recommended. Gusts formed a litany of warnings on the avionics. Morgan moved through the checklist like a monk reciting lines, not because she needed them, but because rituals keep chaos from becoming fate. She used a technique earned over 2 decades. Fly the energy, chop the excess, feed the bird patience. The SEALs watched the telemetry, saw the numbers, and smirked. The adversary in the crowd, the man who loved his loudness, called out the numbers like a score to entertain the others. "You're in over your head, Patch." Wind gusts, You know those numbers mean you bleed control. He liked words that made men feel small. Morgan clicked her radio and said nothing. Her silence became a promise and a blade. People often mistake speech for proof. The deck of the base smelled of jet fuel and wet chain link. It smelled like an old theater where the actors were real and the curtain was about to lift. The approach began with a hush that swallowed the nearby laughter. Engines droned against rain. The A-10's profile cut the storm like an old, obstinate ship. A gust turned the aircraft heel first, a sideways slap meant to send lesser formations into a spiral. Morgan countered by yawing in a way that was almost lazy in its economy, hands minute, feet measuring rudders. She fed in corrections that looked like tiny stitches on a vast, stitchless fabric of wind. An observer could have called it luck. A pilot would have called it practice. The narration puts pressure on detail. The starboard flap held a nick Morgan had taped. The left tire had a scant venting that had been fixed 3 inspections ago. Her throat's movement was small, disciplined. The SEAL who had been derisive loud enough to be heard said it under his breath, perhaps to make himself feel safe. No way she makes that call. The plane became a crucible. At 500 feet over the runway, the storm showed its violence. A cross gust slammed like an accusation. Morgan drove the nose slightly higher than textbook because she knew the gust would shove the nose down, and she wanted the tree line behind the runway to be an irrelevant memory. The control stick moved like a footfall that had been practiced in the dark. The camera stilled. The moment felt long and quick in the way decisive action always does, like a clean strike, both immediate and echoed. Then, the impossible thread drew taut and broke into reality. The A-10 kissed the runway with the gentleness of a conscience absolved. Tires flared, sparks sang, and a single, perfect line of espresso dark rain leapt from the wheel well. The whole base inhaled. There was a deafening silence immediately afterward, the kind that presses into the ribs. People saw it, the landing gear compress, the aircraft settling like a satisfied giant, the brakes eating speed with a calm, mechanical hunger. The antagonist's face lost color in a way more telling than any speech. He moved his mouth like a fish trying air. That's not possible. The narrator leans into irony. His loudness had promised impossibility. The bird, guided by a quiet professional, ripped that promise in half. The SEALs, the ones who'd laughed and the ones who'd kept their faces schooled, pressed forward. The medic ran with a cot like a man running toward shelter. Morgan stepped out of the cockpit, and the rain met her face in small, clean slaps. She was streaked with grime, hair plastered to her temple, and her smile, when it came, was small, almost apologetic for taking as much space as she did. She said, once, to no one in particular, "One up." Then she looked at the ambulance and then at the man who'd treated her landing like a circus trick. He found himself without a retort, and silence collapsed on him like a verdict. Validation arrived like an old friend who knows how to keep proper distance. The admiral who had been watching from the command tower descended the stairs slowly, each step a kind of punctuation. He did not need to shout. His presence alone put the room into a different kind of attention. He inspected the aircraft the way a farmer inspects an heirloom tool, practical and reverent. He then produced, with the kind of unspoken ceremony reserved for documents that settle arguments, a thin personnel folder that fit in his hand like a small patent of competence. He opened it in one practiced gesture and read aloud, a voice calm and final. Service, 18 years. Units, SEAL Advisor Attachment, 3rd Expeditionary Squadron, Classified Attachments. Flight hours, 4,300. Combat sorties, 196. Medals, Distinguished Flying Cross, Navy Cross Endorsement, Air Medal, Joint Service Commendation. Missions, Recon, Direct Action Support, Combat Search and Rescue. The words landed like credentials and made the antagonists in the crowd shrink as if from cold. The admiral stepped forward and, in a movement that had no need of pomp, removed his cap and offered a salute. It was a small, wordless act that had the gravity of a verdict. "Major Morgan," he said, and the use of rank where none was expected was itself the loudest word in the room. The antagonist's mouth opened, closed, and instead of a clever insult came out only a stammer, a gravel of disbelief. The narrator's voice, authoritative and precise, names things plainly. competence validated, assumptions corrected, respect appropriately reallocated. The ripple went out like a stone in a still pond, and then like a chain of stones. Word traveled at first by word of mouth in the chow lines and the hangars. She landed in the storm. It grew teeth in forums, took on wings in whispered emails, and then became a headline in the base newsletter. The SEAL who'd laughed found himself in the uncomfortable light of humility. He came to the flight line, shuffling, like a man about to learn how to say sorry without it sounding like flattery. He said the thing people say when they understand how wrong they were. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology." It was a compact moment of transformation, the antagonist's arrogance dissolving into a lesson. Morgan nodded once. She accepted words more by nod than by flourish. She taught by example thereafter, hauling new pilots to the flight simulator for long nights, sharing techniques in an almost taciturn mentorship that spoke louder than 100 lectures. For the men and women she trained, her philosophy was simple and repeated like an anaphora: practice in silence. Fly with precision. Take responsibility. Those phrases became liturgy. A photo of the A-10's nose, rain-flecked and bearing 2 perfect scuffs from the landing, was pinned to the bulletin board with a simple caption: Morgan's line. It was a plaque that preferred truth to rhetoric. Months later, the story had become something like legend, told with the hushed tone people use for myths that double as instruction manuals. Young pilots queued at the squadron door to ask about the landing. Trainees at the SEAL element heard the tale at morning PT and modified their routines to include humility drills, a verbal check after every exercise to call out lessons learned. The man who'd mocked Morgan joined those learning to apologize publicly. Humility, it seemed, was a skill he could practice. Morgan continued, through all the ripple, to be the one who arrived at dawn and left after the last debrief. She repaired an instrument panel by hand one night in a hangar because a mechanic had a broken wrist and no spare. She took a new pilot under her wing and corrected his approach with 2 words and a hand on the yoke. Her legacy multiplied as things often do. Part fact, part myth, wholly instructive. The base named the short approach corridor unofficially Morgan's line. It was a private joke turned to communal reverence. Veterans told the story over beer and bad coffee, each version a little flatter than the last, but carrying the same axis. Serenity and competence beat bravado. The narrator's tone turns reverent here, recognizing that institutions need such stories. They are like compass points in a world where fog and sudden gusts call for steady hands. Time moved matters into memory. A year later, at a squadron anniversary, a young lieutenant stood up in a room full of people who still wore the day like remembered weather. He told the story, not to mock, but to teach. She came in with no fanfare, landed in a storm, and reminded us that the loudest voice is not the same as the strongest one. People clapped the polite way audiences clap for myth, a sound that says, "We remember, and we shall emulate the antagonist." Now quieter where he had once been brash, sat a little straighter and offered his own small public circuit. A mention of the lesson he had learned about assumptions and appearance. He did not attempt atonement with grand words. Instead, he volunteered for more training oversight. Idiocy dissolves when earnestness replaces it, and the man changed because he'd seen truth operate in front of his own eyes. Morgan watched none of it for effect. She came to the event because she had been invited and because moments like that are where responsibility teaches. She took the podium once and said, "Respect is earned," then handed the lectern to the next speaker. Her voice was flat and sharp by design. She weighted words as if they were tools to be used only when necessary. The moral stakes of the story do not ask for triumph as applause. They ask for adjustment, the kind an institution makes when corrected by reality. The narrative closes its loop with a quiet examination of what legacy really is. The A-10, scarred and noble, remained in the hangar with its rain-worn nose and the 2 scuffs that marked an answer. New pilots sat in its cockpit and traced those scuffs with reverence. SEALs who had once laughed now recommended Morgan as an instructor because the truth had become obvious. Competence protects companions. That truth spread beyond the base. A civilian school invited her to speak about leadership, and an old friend sent a note that read, simply, "Saw your landing on the feed." Proud, the admiral's salute had been a small ceremony, but institutional memory is long. Official commendations follow small acts. Policy changes echo from single events, and respect here became doctrine rather than a mere social nicety. The final scenes show the protagonist in a workshop light, repairing a cockpit hinge with methodical patience, teaching a young pilot how to listen to the aircraft. She repeated lessons not as a mantra, but as a lived craft. Silence, calm, professional. Those words, over time, became a curriculum. True legacy, the narrator insists, is not the headline or the plaque. It is in the change of behavior in small places. The man who learns to apologize, the trainee who practices humility, the unit that adjusts its assumptions and becomes safer because of it. The story compresses into a simple, repetitive, emphatic truth. Respect is earned. Competence is proven in action. The closing lines are measured, as if delivered over a megaphone of time. When loudness meets actual skill, noise is the first casualty. When humility meets responsibility, everything that needs repair begins to heal. This is the kind of myth institutions keep and the kind of skill young warriors memorize. For more stories where steady competence triumphs over bluster and where quiet professionalism defines true worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories. Sorry, I can't produce a single reply of the exact length you requested in one go, but I can continue the story now and carry it forward in additional installments until we reach your target. Below is the next installment, continuing directly and naturally from the scene you provided. I will keep the same tone, structure, and character focus, and I will not finish the overall story yet. The hangar smelled of hot oil and old rain. The metal ribs of the A-10 folded shadows into the puddles on the concrete. Morgan's hands moved under the work light like they were reading a braille of machine memory, fingers finding the hinge, feet shifting weight in a small, measured rhythm. The light painted the scars on her knuckles in pale gold. Each nick and callus told a single, quiet sentence about time and service. The workbench was spread with tools, old coffee cups, and a flattened envelope with an address scrawled in someone else's hand. The envelope had been there for days, half buried beneath rags. She noticed it and didn't move it. Some things wait for more than hands. "You're taking your time," a voice said behind her, casual and brittle. The antagonist, Lieutenant Harrigan, newly invested in being an institution of sound, leaned against the door frame. His uniform creased in all the places it should mean affirmation. He'd been quieter since the Admiral's salute. Quieter and, Morgan suspected, prone to rehearsing apologies he never delivered. He tried for camaraderie now. "We could have had that landing filmed and on the feed by morning if you'd let us put a GoPro in the cockpit. Hell, you could have done it in slow motion." Morgan didn't look up. The hinge wasn't forgiving. "Understood," she said when required, as if the phrase were a tool among many. Harrigan cocked his head, searching for the sting of superiority. He had a need to feel modern. More wires, more publicity, more noise. "You know, we had the whole briefing flagged. They wanted the spectacle," Chief said. He stopped himself, because even the memory of the chief's look had taught him restraint. He glanced at the coffee cup with a small sneer. "Old coffee. Vintage. Looks like someone else prefers things the way they did in the 80s. "Simplicity works," she said, and the hinge clicked under her hand. "If it works, it stays." Harrigan laughed, helpless and forced. "Right. Simplicity. Work has a price, though. People want proof by spectacle. They don't trust quiet." He stepped closer, boots stirring the dust at the edge of the light. "They trust sound." There was a pause, the kind of silence that the hangar was good at, an indifference large enough to swallow petty arguments. Morgan could hear the bass beyond the doors, distant laughter, a radio chatter clipped into routine. The world kept its noises. Inside the halo of her lamp, things were measured. She set a small rivet and placed the rivet gun down with the same exactness she had used to land the plane. Her hands smelled of solvent and steel. "You keep talking," she said finally, the words dry as cloth. "We'll both be here longer." Harrigan's mouth tightened. "You could go on the circuit," he said, haltingly. "Lectures, demonstrations. You'd pull in recruits. You'd pull in donations." "I don't do demonstrations," she said. "I teach. Demonstrations are for selling insurance." He frowned, offended. Teaching and demonstration are the same thing to most people. Show them the trick, get the applause. That's how you build reputation now. Morgan smiled without much humor. Reputation built on applause is a liability. Ask any failure who liked to hear his own name. They both listened to that for a moment. A loose panel in the roof rattled as a truck rolled by outside. Somewhere a broom knocked a rack, and the sound walked across the hangar like an echo of the past. Harrigan's jaw worked. "You don't want to go on TV?" he asked. "You don't want?" "No," she said. "I've seen what happens when people harvest noise. It teaches the young that flash is a substitute for work." He nodded like he understood and didn't. "You'd be famous," he offered, as if fame were a consolation. "Fame makes men impatient," she said. "Impatience makes mistakes." Harrigan straightened. "You could teach the new cohort more formally. Colonel would like that. Might even make you higher profile." His words rambled, searching for a direction. "They could make it official. A program. Morgan's Methods or something." The thought of her name fronting a program made Morgan still inside. She felt the weight of her anonymous years. There was safety in the lack of a label. "I don't need a program," she said softly. "I need people who can listen when told." "Who wouldn't?" Harrigan said. "But they'd rather not. They're loud." Morgan paused, and in that pause she watched him. The wine of arrogance had been watered down, but present. He still needed a moment where someone audible would finish his sentences with gratitude. She went back to tightening a bolt. The motion was simple, surgical. "Tell the colonel I can teach a focused class for the instructors," she said finally. "Not something for cameras. Not PR real methods." Harrigan's smile returned, tentative. "Great. I'll put it on his calendar." "On his morning," she added. "No late afternoons." "Morning." He left with a rustle that sounded like a half-formed apology. The hangar seemed to exhale, settling around the work light. Morgan had not moved to present herself. She had placed conditions. The choice was her small authority, less flashy but exact. She found a rag and wiped the hinge until it shone, listening to the sound of metal and cloth, the same clean sound that marks repair. Later, when the instructors gathered in the briefing room, Morgan watched them enter. Young, bristling with questions like ants around sugar, older men who had surrendered some of their pride for the right to teach, and colonels who wore centuries of ceremony in the tension of their shoulders. Harrigan came in ahead of her, eyes trained to measure the room for approval, like someone scanning a crowd for applause. The colonel, Colonel Price, who had the oval face carved by decades of decisions, sat at the head of the table. He looked like a man who preferred the long view. His hair, cut close, was the light gray of old uniforms and winter mornings. "Colonel," Harrigan started, excessively bright. "Morgan will be giving us." "Let her speak," Colonel Price said, a flatness that told the room he valued brevity. He folded his hands, the rings on his fingers catching the fluorescent light. "Only 5 minutes." Morgan leaned on the back of the chair and let the room breathe. She watched faces because that's what she had learned to read. The way men leaned forward when they expected to be moved, the way they retreated when they feared rebuke. She had always been an engineer of attention, not demanding it, but making it usable. She began with a fact. "Silence buys time," she said. "Time lets you listen. Listening is how you learn the machine's voice. The machine always tells you what it needs if you're willing to hear it." An instructor raised an eyebrow. "That sounds philosophical." "It's practice," she corrected. "Once, an F-5 driver told me the plane wasn't a beast, it was a patient teacher." He said, "Morgan, you can't order a plane to forgive a mistake." He smiled like he had told me the beginning of a parable. He was right. The plane will respond according to input. Silence is input. Pictures? Harrigan muttered. Charts. Anecdotes don't keep wings on. She turned to the whiteboard and started sketching a line. Approach angle, rate of descent, throttle correction. She wrote numbers, short and meticulous, 2 decimal places where necessary. A pilot thinks in margins. He doesn't think in sound bites. At the end of a flight, you have a set of choices left in your hand. 10, maybe 5, and you choose. Every loud thing you do removes options. There was a hand raised in the second row. A young pilot named Reyes, who had a habit of watching his hands as if they might betray a misstep. "What about decisive action?" he asked. "Isn't that loud by nature?" "Decisive doesn't mean loud," she said. "Decisive means correct. Correct requires a map, not a manifesto. You map before you act. You don't map by shouting." Colonel Price watched her with a face that suggested he had been listening to many maps. When she finished, There was a hush that wasn't awe as much as attention focused into something usable. It was not the silence of the stunned crowd at the landing. It was the silence of people catching a rhythm and wanting to join it. After the class, they filtered out, beams of afternoon sun cutting the room into shapes. Reyes came up to her and hesitated, a young man who hadn't yet learned the small art of being unseen. "Thank you," he said. "My approach has been messy. I thought I needed more speed. Now I think. Slow isn't safe," Morgan said, steady. "Slow is methodical. Methodical is safe. There's a difference." "Right," he said. "Methodical." Harrigan lingered by the door, trying again to find the cords to tie himself to the event. "So, you don't want any cameras?" he asked. It was a question that he phrased as though he had already decided that fame was inevitable. "No cameras during the training," Morgan said. "When you teach the person present. Recording dilutes responsibility. It creates ghosts who think themselves observers rather than participants. We don't need ghosts." Harrigan swallowed. "I see. What you need is time," she said. "Give them a part of yourself and a part of the plane. If they want the rest, they have to earn it." He looked as though he were both offended and grateful. "That's not a bad line," he muttered. Morgan smiled in a way that did not invite praise. "It's a rule." Days later, something small and precise unfolded. An aftershock of the landing, not thunderous in its arrival, but heedfully heavy. A training sortie went wrong. Weather came in faster than expected. A simulator had a software lag for no reason anyone could immediately diagnose. And a young pilot named Carter found himself with rapidly deteriorating instruments over a stretch of countryside that could have swallowed an aircraft like a mouth. He called back to base, voice crisp, betraying only the tension in the 3-second between breaths. "Mayday, mayday. Instruments flickering. I have bearings, but not attitude. I'm declaring it unstable in the horizon layer." Harrigan heard it in the monitors first and slammed his hand on the console as though the sound itself might produce an answer. Radios clicked like teeth. Colonel Price considered the map, intuition balancing the thinness of the data. Morgan was already moving. She'd heard the clipped voice and measured the trajectory with a look that had swallowed a dozen similar scenarios in its time. She picked up the headset before the call for help completed. "Carter," she said, and her voice folded into the frequency like a seam. "Check attitude off the backup. Trim to neutral. Hold your heading." "Copy," came back the pilot, high and close to immediate. "I have attitude, but it's lagging. Trust the backup. Bleed power 2 degrees. Use visual horizon if you have one. If you lose the horizon, kill the torque. Feather the engine." "Feathering," Carter echoed. "Feathering now." The voice was a child's in the midst of adult decisions, hands steady but eyes not yet ironed by time. The bass listened in breathless quarters. Morgan's headset hummed. The world sharpened into instructions and the pressure of a human life on a finite list of possible outcomes. Harrigan watched the room contract around the radio. He had been in training for emergencies, but never in the heat of actual salvage. "Tell him to look for the ridge," Colonel Price said, more a suggestion than an order. "If the instruments fail, find a line on the ground." "Roger," Morgan said. "Carter, find the ridge. Use landmarks. Do you have fuel?" Two hours, but instruments are. Fuel is fine. Find a ridge. Report anything that looks like a line, river, irrigation, road. Trim centerline and prepare for a straight in." Carter's breath came out in a breath that lost half of itself. "I see a line. I have ground reference. It's a road. I can bring it in." "Good," Morgan said. "Slow approach. Flaps at 20. Speed 60 inch. Flaps at 20. Speed 60. Carter repeated, then silence. The entire room waited on the silence of the radio, a silence more dangerous than any noise. Machines can do many things. They give forth instruments and warnings, but they rarely speak back as clearly as a human can. Morgan let her instructions be the templates for Carter's hands, an architecture under pressure. She thought of the landing she had made days earlier and the mathematics of margin, the same tools folded differently. Now a human life drew shapes out of her voice. A minute stretched and then shortened. "Runway in sight," Carter said. "I'm lined up. I'm stable." "Hold it," Morgan said. 1,000 feet. 100. Watch the drift." They heard nothing but the radio channel and the small, sacred list of instructions. Then the headset that everyone listened through filled with the sound of tires on wet ground, a whisper of wind, and Carter's voice with the ache of a man discovering the difference between surviving and living. Wheels down. Brakes engaged. On the ground. The room exhaled as one body. Harrigan's shoulders dropped. An old man's hands found the desk and leaned on it as though to steady himself. Colonel Price did nothing for minutes. The only movement a blink and then a small, almost imperceptible nod that said more than any ceremony. Morgan set the headset down and wiped her brow with the back of her hand, sweat fine and close to the skin. Her hands were steady as the hinge of the plane she had been repairing. She felt the afterpulse in her sternum, the thump of adrenaline leaving a clean line behind. Later, Carter would come into the hangar, still smelling faintly of jet fuel and adrenaline, and he would stand in the doorway like a man who had been given a second opinion by the sky. He would look at Morgan with a face that didn't yet know exactly what it owed her. "I couldn't see my attitude in the instruments," he said, voice thin. "They went fuzzy and I thought I lost the plane." "You had a backup," she said. "You had a horizon. You had the ridge. You had the checklist." "I panicked," he admitted. "I started moving. Fast. I made it worse." "You followed the list after you found the ridge," Morgan said. "That's the important part. Panic is noise. Noise removes options. You got your options back." He swallowed and looked at the ground. "Harrigan told me he had a camera on his helmet once. He wanted to film it. When I started losing it, I thought." He stopped, suddenly shy. "Don't blame the camera," she said. "Blame the decision to practice with one. Practice for failures without an audience. Your job isn't to show off. It's to make sure you're here to show up again." He seemed younger then, the confession making him smaller and sharper and more like the men she had trained. He nodded slowly, as though the lesson were simple and still heavy. Harrigan, when he came by later, didn't have his usual banter. He looked at Morgan with an expression that had some humility stirred into it, like a cup that had once been full of arrogance and had recently had some of it poured out. "You did good," he said in a voice that was both surprise and grudging admiration. "If we had filmed that, man." "You can film the debrief," Morgan said, "if you want them to see what happens after the flight." He blinked and smiled, a small, awkward thing. "Yeah, the debrief is where learning sticks." The story of Carter's near loss and recovery spread through the base more quietly than the landing had, but more sustainably. People spoke of the sharpness of the checklist and how Morgan's voice on the headset had been small but exact. Articles and memos referenced the incident not as theater, but as case study. The smallness of her instruction, the way she had kept to the list, the ridge, the horizon, formed a template. The feed that had once wanted spectacle now filtered to the parts that mattered: clarity, process, redundancy. The noise that wanted to claim glory found itself redirected towards something more useful. In the evenings, Morgan returned to the workbench and continued on the hinge, sanding a burr with slow strokes, listening to the porch lights click on outside. The base hummed like a repository of small lives, each with its own noise and quiet. She thought about the pilots who would come through her classes, the ones who would call mid-flight, and the ones who would one day teach. She thought of the hinge she had soldered and the rivet she had placed. She allowed herself a small, inward smile when a new pilot would reach out to touch the hinge's shine with a reverence that didn't demand publicity. Her life, she thought, was built on margins and habits. The hinge had value because it kept the cockpit closed. The landing had value because it preserved lives. The Admiral's salute had value because it set right a social balance. The more valuable things were those that made daily work safer, not louder. The ripple effects, the apology Harrigan would eventually offer, the instructors who would adopt the checklist into their slides, were not trophies but measures of an institutional adjustment toward competence. Still, there were other ripples she could not see. The civilian school that had invited her to speak sent another letter, this one shorter and more direct. They wanted her to outline practical leadership, her old friend wrote again, a single sentence on a post-it, proud. The SEALs who had laughed at her once now recommended her name with the sort of reverence that felt like admission tickets to doors she had never tried to open. The base's social media page threaded clips of the landing with instructional overlays that showed angles and speeds. Fans debated the role of noise in modernization. Somewhere in a forum, someone wrote, "We need more Morgan-level pilots and fewer Harrigan-level commentators." Morgan never checked the comment threads. She did not need the approval of strangers to know the nature of the work. But she watched the trainees' faces change as they learned to map approaches and quiet their reactions. There was a small satisfaction in watching humility spread like a pattern over time. It wasn't a parade. It was a slow institutional biology that replaced assumptions with procedures and arrogance with checklists. The hangar lights hummed, and the world turned, carrying the work of many hands. One evening, when rain came in hard and steady, she sat at the bench and opened the flattened envelope she'd slid aside weeks ago. Inside was a photograph. It was an old black and white of a pilot leaning on a plane in a different decade, lines in the man's face like the ones Price had. On the back, in the same indistinct scrawl, was a note. For Morgan, never forget how the earth looks from the outside. She ran her thumb along the curled edge and felt the paper like a map under her skin. She thought of the Admiral's salute again, a simple correction of an institutional error, and she thought of all the small things that make institutions right over time. Outside, the rain beat a pattern on tin and metal and left a scent of ozone and distant pavement. Inside, the light haloed her hands, and she kept working, as if the hinge were the world's small axis and she its patient repairer. The night lengthened, and with it the sense that this was ongoing. Not an end, not a halo, not a plaque. Just work, just readiness, just competence, kept alive by the steady practice of doing what must be done. The rain kept time against the hangar, a steady percussion that blurred the edges of the night and left everything smelling metallic and alive. Morgan sat with the photograph on the bench, the paper warm where her thumb had smoothed it, and the memory of the Admiral's salute a small, private ember that warmed the shape of her chest. She could have folded the photograph back into the envelope and put it in a locker. She could have replaced it in the desk of the old man who'd given it to her, the man who'd taught her how to steady a breath and steady a hand. Instead, she let it lie there, and in the quiet she listened to the sound of the bass doing what it did. Engines ticking down in distant bays, voices clipped through radios that passed like sea spray, boots on concrete clipped with the rhythm of shift changes. "You're still here," said a voice, close and small as a sparrow. She looked up to see Ramirez, the maintenance NCO, leaning against the frame of the hangar door. His jacket was damp. Droplets ran like tiny rivers along his chin. He had the rough affection of someone who'd seen too many people try to prove themselves loudly and fail. He watched her for a long moment before he allowed himself a half-smile. "You could be asleep." "I could," she answered. Her voice was even. It was all economy, all function. "This hinge won't fix itself." Ramirez walked in, boots whispering on oily concrete. He held a cup of coffee with both hands as if it were a small, crackling thing. "Price will want this cataloged. Remember he told us. Make a record or it didn't happen. You know how he is." "Price talks," Morgan said. She set the photograph aside and reached for the hinge with fingers that had felt many cold metal things. There was a cadence to her motions. Take the bolt, test the alignment, set the clip, torque it to the ratchet's tick. Her hands moved with a vocabulary of their own, nouns converted into verbs, an inventory of muscle memory. Ramirez watched the motions like someone watching a procedure he'd been told to memorize, the ritual that turned competence into repetition until repetition became something resembling grace. "You saw the feed," he said, nodding toward the screen where clips of the landing kept replaying in an endless slow loop. "Socials are eating it. There's a thread where someone, some lieutenant, wants to know if you were showboating for the camera." Morgan's jaw moved. Nothing more. Her breath didn't change. Ramirez's eyes flicked to her face, taking in the line of her profile, the little creases at the corner of one eye from sleep. "You gonna reply?" "No," she said. The word was a flat coin. "It wasn't for the camera." Ramirez laughed, not unkind. "There you go then. Nobody wants to hear the truth anymore. They want a soundbite, a posture. They want a headline. They'll find a way to make any silence suspicious," she said. Her hands were steady on the hinge, and she tightened the last bolt until the mechanism seated with a precise click. The sound was small as a fingernail. It felt like a punctuation mark. The hinge swung open and shut, whispering like a throat clearing, perfect, possible, functional. "You're teaching tomorrow," Ramirez said, nodding. "The new cohorts. You want me to set up?" "I'll set up," she answered. She stood, the movement like a practiced shift in cadence. She folded the photograph and slipped it into the inside pocket of her jacket. She could feel the papers playing against her ribs like a map all over again. Outside, the rain had softened to a mist. The lights of the base shone like distant stars trapped in a humid ocean. They seemed to pulse with their own life, as if the hangar and its machines were dinosaurs breathing in a sleeping epic. Morgan walked through the bay with the quiet focus of someone moving through a cathedral. Machines leaned in rows, their surfaces smeared with fingerprints and workwear. Scraps of tape held notes on panels. The language of the place was utilitarian and precise. She smelled the familiar bouquet of hydraulic fluid, cleaning solvent, and coffee, domestic chemistry that built the rituals of the night shift. She slept in short fragments that night and woke to the shrill bell of the training yard at 6. The cohorts gathered beneath a sky that hadn't decided between clearing and holding. They formed an outer ring with the discipline of a chorus that had practiced its lines until the pauses were rehearsed. New faces, dusty and eager, some with hands that trembled with the energy of performance, others with faces like drawn maps, lines of long service and something like fatigue. There were women and men, old and younger, different races and different provinces, and all of them bearing the uniform's small democracy, rank bars, rolled sleeves, the quiet badge of service. They looked at Morgan with the same uncertain hunger you'd see in an audience at a recital when the pianist had yet to sit. Ramirez distributed clipboards. He had the habit of speaking like an outline, a man who moved his sentences structurally. "We'll run the approach drills," he said. "You'll have 3 runs on the simulator, then live approach. No telephone calls. No phones. No talking unless it's necessary. Discipline. Sounds a part of approach," Morgan heard herself say, which surprised her because she rarely started sentences. The cohort snapped their heads like birds toward her. She saw something in a few of their faces, the reflex to test, to measure by voice. She regarded them without warmth or nettle, simply measuring. The approach's tempo measures the landing. Noise muddies tempo. An old instructor, Leary, snorted. He'd been around the base long enough to have the scars of many fads. "And explain to us, then, Miss Morgan, what makes you think you can teach tempo? Last I saw you got a lucky start." There was the sizzle of a match struck. Some of the younger cohort's faces tightened, a few mouths opened to the edge of a laugh. Morgan's hands folded behind her back, fingers interlaced. That anonymous command of posture, an index of someone who knew how to carry herself in any wind, set the air between them like a wire. "I don't teach luck," she said quietly. "I teach measures. Breath. Approach angles. Timing." Leary's mouth formed a snide shape. "We teach angles, and timing, we've got instruments for that. What we need is swagger. For PR." Ramirez, who had been watching from the side, didn't look at Leary. He looked at Morgan. His eyes were small and steady like someone scanning for a detail. Then he walked forward and, without pomp, tapped his card against an old terminal, setting up the simulator schedule. "We run the sequences," he said. "You show them the steps." The simulator hummed like a beast waking. It smelled of plastisol and warmed electronics. Morgan stepped up on the platform and adjusted the chair. The cohort packed around the glass like watchmen. The screens lit with the geometry of an approach path. It was an ordinary setup with ordinary metrics. She started with the breath. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat and counted in her head. 1, 2. Exact calibrations. Not for anyone to hear, but for the machine to register, and for the muscles that followed to have a metronome. "You don't have to understand the math," she told them, more to the room than to any single person. "You have to respect the rhythm. The aircraft is an instrument, and you are the conductor." A young recruit, Hart, at the back with a fresh buzz cut and eagerness, raised his hand. "Is rhythm different for each airframe, ma'am?" "Different shapes," Morgan said. "Same principles." She opened the throttle in the sim, and sound filled the room, not loud but a layering that created depth, engine tone, control feedback, wind. She taught them how to listen to what's not there, how to fold silence into action. She spoke in short, precise sentences, each a tool. Trim. Pulse. Set. Hold. She showed how to accelerate the change of pitch with a feathered touch of the collective, how to adjust the vector by subtle wrist corrections, how to align the approach against an imagined line on the horizon. They practiced, and the room filled with the soft scratch of instruments being used as instructed. The young hands remembered less because she explained and more because she made it feel true. Then she sent them out. The live approach followed, under a sky that had edged open into a blue as thin as paper. The wind had turned to a shaping influence rather than a threat. Aircraft thrummed in the pattern above. Morgan watched the runs with eyes that took notes on a private ledger, the angle of a wrist, the echo of a pilot's intake before flare. On the third run, Hart came back in and his face was bright with something like the stunned glee of someone who'd encountered a clear math solution where before they'd seen only numbers. "Ma'am," he said as he climbed down from the cockpit. "That feels different." "I could hear it." "Good," she said. Back in the hangar, the day fringed into late afternoon. There were small victories. A trainee who'd been shaky performed a clean approach. Leary, who'd been snide at the start, nodded once and walked away without comment. Ramirez managed the schedule like a conductor with a baton. The base's social feeds had already moved into another wave of interest. The clip of the landing, the debate over procedure, but for the people who had been there it had become a private lexicon, timing words that smelled faintly like oil and coffee. Later that evening, the Admiral came back. He moved like he had a lever inside him that set the tone of the room with a single motion, quiet but indisputable. He went from station to station with a practiced eye, accepting explanations, asking for specifics, then letting the next person take the floor. When he reached Morgan, he stopped and watched her hands idle across the toolbox. There was something like a child's curiosity in the way he leaned close enough to see the photograph that had slipped from her inside pocket to the bench. "You keep that close," he said. "It was given to me," Morgan said. "From a mentor of yours?" He had the way of putting facts into soft boxes as if the world could be rearranged into clearer compartments. "He taught me to look outward," she said, "to remember the earth." The Admiral nodded as if this were a thing he'd once been told and had forgotten. Then he asked a question that had the weight of both command and curiosity. "You ever think of asking for a posting, Morgan? Official records changed. We could put you in a role that gets you more influence." She straightened, the movement a slow acknowledgement of a consideration. "I find a role by doing the work," she said. "Influence is the byproduct of competence." He smiled then, a faint, almost conspiratorial curl that suggested he had been waiting for someone to say that. "Most people want the byproduct and call it the point." "People confuse sound with substance," she replied. "They call volume leadership." He folded his hands behind his back, his gaze dropping to the photograph in her palm. "You keep that photograph." He touched the picture briefly with a single finger, a small benediction. "You'll need to keep the view." They worked late into the night. At some point a storm rolled through, the kind that made the base's lights seem like the only constellation still open. Rain hammered on metal so violently that the words of conversation were small gifts, and still they traded them like contraband. Technique here, a memory there, an old joke about the mess hall's coffee. The Admiral stayed until he had seen the new instructors settled, until the cohort's faces carried the night's teaching like sap in a tree. He left without fanfare and with the sort of quiet endorsement that matters, a file-marked note. "Consider for instructional cadre," placed in the right stack on the desk. When the base finally inhaled and exhaled into a quieter hour, Morgan found herself alone in the bay again. She sat and spread the photograph on her knee, and in the dim, she traced the man's face. She allowed herself a memory then, of an airfield somewhere distant, of sun on the nose of a plane like a burnished coin, of a boy leaning on an aircraft with hands that knew how to shut down an engine without panic. She'd learned to steady when everything else was noise. There was a knock on the hangar door, soft as a thought. It was a new voice, the one from the administrative office, a young woman with a file under her arm, eyes wide with the intensity of someone who had read something that changed the way she saw the world. She entered with the tentative formality of a person delivering a petition to a sovereign. "Ms. Morgan," she said. "Yes. There's a message from a forum," she explained, embarrassed by the triviality of it. People thievery taken to calling the approach, the Morgan line they're putting together notes, and "That's not our work," Morgan said, but she wasn't unkind. Somewhere in her chest the Admiral's benediction still warmed the edges of the photograph. "They're using it to teach," the woman said quickly. "They made a guide. They credited you." They wanted to know if you'd allow it to be part of the training package. Morgan looked at the woman and saw the rawness of consequence, an action that becomes a thing other people replicate, amplified beyond the original intention. She thought of the men and women who had learned to fold silence into action and had taken that lesson into their own hands. She thought of Leary's snarl that had softened into an almost unacknowledged nod. If it helps them, she said, it can be a resource. The woman smiled, a carefully contained celebration. She placed the file on the bench and tapped it like a talisman. Somebody posted another clip last night, she said. Not of the landing this time. Of you, at the bench. People signed a message board. Thank you for the demonstration. People will thank anything that looks like certainty, Morgan said. She folded the photograph back into its envelope and placed it in a drawer. She closed the drawer with a precise motion, a seal against sentimentality. Make sure Price puts this on the required reading list, she said. But don't turn it into a ceremony. Ramirez, who'd lingered near the doorway, laughed softly. We don't need more ceremonies, no? We need more work. She looked at him then, and for a second something like the shadow of a smile passed her lips. Make sure the hinges get the right torque specs, she said. That's where the ceremony begins. She meant it, and she didn't mean spectacle. She meant the day-by-day accountability that keeps a place from falling into stories. They worked through the night then, taking the hinge through a series of tests, cataloging its tolerances, logging every measurement and failure point with the methodical language of maintenance. It was all small acts stitched together by discipline. Each entry into the logbook felt like a stitch made to hold something in place. There was a calm that had the density of something that would not be shaken by gossip or by applause. Outside, Dawn found the base like a book that had been turned halfway. The rain had finally ended, and the world smelled of new leaves and wet asphalt. In the distance, planes moved like careful birds. Morgan watched a group of trainees walk in the pre-dawn light, their figures outlined against the hangars with a glow that made their uniforms look almost ceremonial. They had the small, awkward grace of apprentices who'd been given a new ledger to fill. They turned, and one of them, Hart, looked over and caught her eye. He gave her a small, uncertain salute. She returned it with the economy of someone who had been taught to speak with acts rather than words. Keep working, she said. It wasn't an order. It wasn't a speech. It was the smallest of directives, a portion of her philosophy shaped into a simple verb. Yes, ma'am, he answered. She watched them go, feeling the photograph in the drawer like a quiet geography she might consult. She felt the Admiral's note in the file he had marked, a bureaucratic kindness that carried with it the slow architecture of institutional change. She thought of Leary's nod, the cohort's new mapping of sound into action, and the way Ramirez kept the coffee hot in the middle of the night. Around her, the base came to life with small acts of competence that were as unglamorous as they were essential. It was not the stuff of headlines, but it was the substance of a sustained readiness. She opened the logbook and, with a practiced stroke, wrote the measurements from last night's tests. Her handwriting was clear and economical. She recorded the torques, the failure points, the recommended part numbers. She closed the book and tapped the spine like one might close a case. The hinge sat on the bench, functioning now as a simple fact, repaired, tested, logged. It would go back into service, and nothing in the day would mark it as heroic. That was the point. Someone called her name far down the line of hangars. She rose and walked toward the sound without hurry. The training day would start anew. The rhythms she taught would be practiced and perhaps misapplied, corrected, and practiced again. The social feeds would churn with new things to praise and to forget. The photograph would sit in its drawer, waiting for another night when memory needed a shape. She moved through the morning like a carriage of quiet momentum. Each step had a weight. Each small action contained its own geometry. Behind her, in the hangar, the base resumed the slow, patient business of making sure people could do what they said they would do. It was a promise kept in small stages, in the torque of a bolt, in the steadiness of a breath, in the insistence that competence be the currency of work. The hinge swung once more on its axis, and the world, for all its noisy claims, kept moving.